I watched roofs fly off homes. I've seen other buildings underwater. And so this really has been a serious storm. And I only saw it from a localized area. I can only imagine how many people were impacted, just given the scale of how big the storm is hitting such a populous state.
Heck, I mean, it's quite unbelievable to see exactly what is going on there. I mean, in terms of preparedness, how much was put in place before Milton hit?
Well, you had millions of people trying to evacuate, this being the biggest evacuation in Florida since Irma hit back in 2017. The tricky part, though, is that people ran out of gas as they were trying to leave. You know, they were fleeing the western part of Florida and in large quantities, and some people ran out of gas on the highway.
Oh, I think we've...
you can imagine, the phone's been ringing off the hook. My apologies, I'm still here. But it's been absolutely incredible for so many people. One other thing that we've seen, too, you know, just 2 weeks ago, Helene came through, caused a storm surge that devastated part of the coastline. And now, once again, we're getting an even greater storm surge. So I think, if anything, what happened 2 weeks ago scared people into taking action this time. So that's the only piece of good news for getting two back-to-back storms.
Matthew, is there a glimmer of hope in the sense that the storm has been downgraded? There was fears that it was going to be a Category 5 storm. It was downgraded to 3, and now I believe it's gone down to Category 2.
Yeah, so right now it's weakening from a tropical standpoint, but the issue is it's undergoing something called extratropical transition, or basically converting into a non-tropical storm. And part of that involves dry air wrapping in on the backside. Now, 9 times out of 10, that would kind of kill the storm slowly. However, this time it didn't do that. It induced something called a sting jet. And it's a very weird niche meteorological phenomenon where basically you have dry air wrapping in the backside of the storm, cutting underneath the moist air. So rain tries to fall in the dry air. It can't, it dries up. And so that kind of part of the cloud dries up and the dry air becomes heavier. It rushes towards the ground and it pulls strong winds from the upper atmosphere with it. And so you're able to get crazy gusts down to the surface that you otherwise wouldn't get. And that's why the backside was even worse than the first side and why we've seen so much wind damage for so many people, even after the main part of the storm passed.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare. Matthew, good to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much indeed. It's grim, the worst hurricane in 100 years hitting the west coast.
Hurricane Milton made landfall on Florida's west coast just a few hours ago at around 8:30 p.m. local time, a little sooner and further south than expected, offering the state a glimmer of hope.
Listed as Category 3, maximum listed winds of 120 miles an hour. It's been reduced now to Category 1.
It is being called the worst in a 1,000-year flood, with the US National Weather Service issuing the highest level of flood warning to more than 2 million residents. 1.6 million people are currently experiencing blackouts.
I thought Florida was on the east coast.
But it's coming from the west coast of Florida.
Right.
Coming up that way.
Very confusing. What you need to do is make some sense of it with meteorologist at Weather Trending, John Hammond, who can explain all. Morning to you, John. I mean, why is this so bad?
Well, one reason, actually, Stephen, is the unusual track that it's taken. I mean, if you take the storm we had a couple of weeks back, Helene, now that took a more sort of conventional track northwards across another part of Florida, but a less populated part of Florida, and it swept its way north through the Carolinas. This one, unusually, has tracked its way kind of west to east and slammed straight in to the west coast of Florida and hit particularly populated areas. Of course, it's the tourist belt from sort of Tampa and St. Pete eastwards through Orlando towards Daytona Beach. And Milton is following that track. So millions of people impacted by the combination of the storm surge. What's a storm surge? Well, a storm surge actually is when the ocean bodily moves inland, because a hurricane is a vortex, it's a vacuum, and it sucks up the sea and dumps it inland. So you've got 15 foot of water and a combination of seawater, rain, and unfortunately sewage, which will be inundating coastal areas around Tampa Bay and southwards through Sarasota. That's going to take, well, days to subside, I'm afraid, because the land in Florida is so flat, it ain't going to run away very quickly. So you've got the storm surge to contend with. We've had, unfortunately, fatalities from tornadoes already. there will be further fatalities, I fear, from the combination of storm surge, tornadoes, and more widely, phenomenal amounts of rainfall. 5 inches of rain in an hour, we just cannot comprehend that much rain in a short space of time. Further heavy rain to come, although the storm technically has weakened, i.e. the peak of the winds has gone down a little bit. Still damaging winds sweeping their way west to east across Florida, gusts approaching 100 miles an hour. So there's going to be a lot of trees down, unfortunately, a lot of structural damage as well. So although, yes, it has weakened to some extent, I'm afraid Milton is still going to do colossal amounts of damage over the next several hours before, as you can see from that graphic, it sails off into the Atlantic. The sun will be out tomorrow across Florida. The winds will be light, but I'm afraid the clearing up operation will take weeks and weeks and weeks.
Passes. John, how much of a glimmer of hope, if at all, is it that the storm has downgraded? I mean, there was fears that it was going to be Category 5, which is the most powerful. It's now, I believe, a Category 1 storm.
It is a Category 1, but, Category 1 hurricane is still capable of doing a huge amount of damage with gusts higher than we typically see on this side of the Atlantic. 60, 70, 80 mile an hour gusts is enough to take trees down. It's enough to blow houses down, unfortunately, in some cases. And it's not just the wind, Ellie. It's the rain, actually, probably for many, which is going to cause the most disruption. As I say, Florida is very flat indeed. So although the hurricane has weakened to some extent, it's still a hurricane. And it's still going to produce a lot of rainfall, strong winds, and the clear-up operation, I'm afraid, will take a lot longer than that. As I said at the start, it's the fact that this is the tourist belt. There will be millions of people, some of them Brits, who won't have been prepared for this adequately enough. And one feature of this storm, Ellie, actually is how quickly it intensified over the last few days. It was just a little disturbance in the atmosphere just a few days ago across the Gulf of Mexico. And this rapidly intensified, supercharged by phenomenally warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The seas in the Gulf of Mexico at the moment are, over 30 degrees. That's unusually warm. And that supercharged this storm and enabled it to develop so rapidly. So people didn't have a huge amount of time to prepare. And many of those, of course, tourists are not used to this sort of weather. So we'll see. We'll see how much damage there's been when the sun comes up and we start to see the scenes of devastation, which will inevitably unfold once we go through the day and the camera crews are out, and we'll see just how much in terms of flooding, in terms of storm damage as well, which has been brought across Florida. And you can see from that animation, it is moving its way west to east. In a few hours' time, it will have cleared the east coast. And as I say, the sun will come out, the winds will have died down, but the damage will have been done. It's actually been quite a quiet start to the hurricane season. Meteorologists had thought this was going to be a very active hurricane season. Up to now, it hasn't been, but we're playing catch up now, both with Helene, which we had a couple of weeks back, now this one. There are no signs of another storm over the next few days hitting the same part of America, thank goodness, but we're only sort of halfway through the hurricane season, so there's time yet for further storms to develop, either in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Atlantic. So watch this space, and it won't be really until December when the hurricane season is finally over.
Oh, well, let's hope not much more happens. John, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed.